Phumlani Majosi. This is the Phumlani Majosi show. I'm back this week to tackle the most important political and economic issues. I'm joined by Bheki Mahlobo. He is a popular economist in South Africa. He's got very interesting views on our economy. He recently wrote on Business Day a piece titled "Charting a Path to SA's Economic Renewal." Bheki, how are you? So it's wonderful to see you. All good.
Phumlani, it's wonderful to see you again, and it's all good. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Yeah, man, wonderful to see you. I mean, I was in California this past April, and then our schedule it couldn't work out. I couldn't see you because that's where we are based these days. Eh? You just came to see us down here in South Africa.
Yeah, that's where I'm based there, but I haven't left South Africa. This is still very much my home. I'm just there pursuing my master's as I had this ambition to complete my master's in economics there in the States. And I'm sorry I couldn't catch you when I was there, but definitely happy to see you and happy to be on your show. And whenever you're there again, I'll make it a priority, number one priority to see you.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, you should do that so we can have some nice coffee or lunch and talk SA affairs. In
Yeah.
California. Yeah, yeah. So, Peggy, tell me, um, you know, um, the problem of dismal economic growth, right? We only grew by 0.6% last year, and over the past 10 years, we've grown at less than 1%, which is, way below our annual population growth rate. And you write that in your piece, you write that we've been underperforming, performing
Mhm.
badly in contrast to other emerging markets, to our peers. What's going on here, Peggy? Why are we having this dismal economic growth that we've seen for more than a decade now?
Yeah, exactly. So that article that you've quoted there, it was inspired by the thinking of which I've seen other analysts as well as commentators looking at those numbers that you've suggested there. Over the past 17 years, South Africa has definitely underperformed emerging market norms, average of about 0.8% over the past decade, that growth rate. What does that mean in comparison to emerging markets? Well, they were growing at close to 4%, and the global average was about 3%. It means that the other emerging markets have been growing four times greater than that of South Africa. But really, the crux of that article is that we become so focused on the stagnation that the country has seen over the past decade that we need to also think about what are the economic opportunities that are actually on the table, that lie on the table right in front of us. And should we get that right, we can become the nation that emulates those growth levels. For example, you asked the question of why is it that we've stagnated? Well, if we look at, for example, investment levels, this is the commitment by businesses. Think about ordinary shop, for example, or a business owner that takes money from their bank account and invests it in the operation of their businesses, either through expanding their operation, which would mean hiring more people. This would also be the mines, for example, in Rustenburg. You're suddenly expanding as there's exploration happening, and the people in that neighboring town would therefore be employed. That number, fixed investment level as a proportion of GDP, sits at about 15%. Compared to that of other nations that's growing at about 4%, their number sits at north about 20%. So we're about 10 percentage points from where the country needs to be. And the resulting consequences of that is what we've seen over the past decade. And the crux of that is the way of thinking that we're seeing from a policy perspective that's not allowing South Africa, which I think could be easily achieved, to get to where we need to be, which is what we see in other countries. It's very normal having a growth rate of 4%. It's very unnormal to have a growth rate that's sub 1%.
Mm, mm. And I guess that explains the very high unemployment rate. Am I correct? The fact that we have
100%.
60% youth unemployment rate, you have plus 40% unofficial, official rate. Please tie the growth issue to employment or unemployment for us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, well, business confidence informs the fixed investment number. So the commitment by business to invest in the country informs that number that we just spoke about. And out of that number, we get our growth rate. And out of the growth rate number, we get the number of people employed or the number of people unemployed. And what the country has seen is that over the past 17 years, we have now the highest unemployment rate that the country has seen of about 32.9%. And a youth unemployment rate if you include the expanded definition, which includes people that have given up looking for employment, that's sitting at about 72%.
Mm.
So a low fixed investment number infers of a high unemployment number because businesses are not expanding. Businesses are not expanding their operations, which will allow the number of people employed as well as the trickling down of the unemployment rate. And we spoke here a little bit about where I'm based in California, USA, and what I saw, which I
Yeah,
thought
what
was
do you see there,
absolutely
Bheki? What are you
amazing.
seeing there? How is what you see there different from what you see here? I
Yes.
mean, as an economist,
Most,
tell us, yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, I come from rural parts of the country and as well as that in the city as well, where majority of young people, if you recall that number that I've mentioned here, have been unemployed for a number of years. And when I landed in California, which I thought was absolutely amazing, was that most of the people that I interacted with, which were studying, which were also freshly out of university as well, they were employed. They have a youth unemployment rate, compare that to South Africa, which is above 70%.
Mm,
Employment rates of about 4.2%. That I thought was absolutely remarkable. But for the
mm,
people there, and I think it should be the case that for the people here, also in South Africa, is that it's a normal thing to have. It's normal to have businesses expanding. The most amazing thing that I saw there was a Popeye shop opening and saying there was a hiring sign there and saying we're looking for people to work. And it's a normal thing for a growing emerging market to actually see that. But not only that, it doesn't only happen in America. It happens in Chile. It happens in other emerging markets where you're actually seeing the expansion of businesses. These may seem a little bit of broad terms, but what is the expansion of businesses? It's just ordinary people that would be allowed to start up their own businesses. This happens quite a lot also in South Africa. We have an entrepreneurial mindset amongst the young in the country that try to solve the dilemma that they faced with, the harsh reality on the ground that they wake up in the morning and they need to go to work. They try to go to a taxi, but they're confronted by the political as well as the economic reality that the country is in. There's protests outside because there's no electricity, as well as that of high levels of crime and lawlessness that happens in the country. And the businesses, therefore, sit on cash or diversify it as well outside of the country. And that's not normal. It's not what South Africa should be. And I think we can easily see a country that jettisons that trajectory. And that's what I saw. I saw an extremely wealthy nation where most of the young people were employed. Most of the people there were also educated in the vast pool of skill that's available. And I look at this and I'm like, we are very much the same. South Africa has those same categories that would see the unemployment rate trickle down from where it currently is to where it needs to be, which is emerging market norms of about 10%.
So you are saying that our problem is low levels of investment, right? There is an investment issue. Now, I want you to tell me as to, in your assessment, in your opinion, in your view, in your judgment, why do we have a lack of investment? Could it be because of bad government policies that disincentivize businesses to expand? What could it be? Because I saw somewhere where you were saying that the problems of Black economic empowerment, along with the problems of expropriation of land without compensation or expropriation laws, if I can use
Yes.
the term, that such is really suppressing investment. Explain that to us.
It is most certainly from a policy perspective that South Africa's growth number is sub 1%. If you
Mm,
follow that trend from 2008, where expropriation or compensation, which is not a land policy as it's portrayed to be, this act allows at some point for the expropriation of fixed and immovable assets below market value.
mm,
If you are an ordinary person working a spaza shop or working a that sells amagwinya, fat cakes for people that don't know what amagwinya is.
mm,
What essentially that policy allows the government to do at some point in time is to take your trademark, be it the trademark of your business, as well as to remove the assets of your business. It allows the government to take the value of your property, which would be valued by some agent, and pay you below that value.
mm,
It's to the taking away of private property in the country. And corporations, ordinary corporations, it's not just American firms that we've seen the South African media say that they're making demands or the officials making demands. This is everyone else, sovereign nations around the country, as well as multinational corporations all around the world look at South Africa's policy from an expropriation or compensation perspective, from its empowerment policies, which are seen as a tax on investment, that low investment number that we've talked about earlier on, is as a consequence of those policies that have acted as a tariff. South Africa, we are tariffing ourselves out of the investment levels that the country needs to see for us to grow. And if you follow that trend, which these policies started to emerge from 2008 up until where we are, it translates to a fixed investment number, which is below the market, emerging market norms, as well as that of a very high unemployment number, as well as 80% of those people that are unemployed currently having a job without or having without a job for more than a year. It's the consequence of the policy that we're seeing from the ruling government, and that policy is a reflection, a mirror on the way of thinking within that administration, which has not been to the result of the betterment of South Africans. And the consequence of that is where we currently find ourselves in today.
Now, Bheki, the ANC is going to push back, right? And its supporters and the proponents of Black economic empowerment, of empowerment policies, or at least of the current empowerment policies. They are going to say to you, Bheki, we have to address the injustices of the past. We need to close the gap between the rich and the poor, between the blacks and whites, right, in the country. That you need to have preference policies or race-based policies or black economic empowerment as it is to address our past. As an economist, how would you respond to that? If it's not BE, then what kind of empowerment do we need as South Africa?
I started off talking with you, Phumlani, with a whip towards the ANC, but actually, I'd like to give credibility to the ANC, which is going to answer your question. There was actually massive redress that was done in this country that I think is not often shed light on. If you look at the track record of the own ANC, the ANC that has resulted with this growth number that we're looking at right now, it was a completely different administration just 17 years ago. Follow that trend from 1994 until 2008. And I'll explain this from a rural South African, a grandmother in the
Yeah.
Eastern Cape, who was my late grandmother, for example, went to bed in 1994 without having electricity. Her kids as well, struggling to find education as well as employment. Fast forward that track from 1994 until 2008, and what she has, instead of having to make a fire at night for warm meals, she has an oven in her house, and her kids have been educated as well as that have had jobs. Those are the numbers that the ANC once achieved, where if you look at the proportion of households that went to bed without electricity for cooking, in 1994, it was about 49%. For that same indicator, that number declines to 20%. Those number of people employed, it was about 8 million in 1994, and follow that number until 2008, and it has nearly doubled. There was indeed redress that was occurred. And that redress was accomplished with a growth number averaging about 5% between 2004 and that of 2007. We were growing at the same rate as emerging markets, which is why I'm so hopeful and bullish of the long-term trajectory of this country, because we once achieved that. And we achieved that because we were right on policy. We were ruthless when it came to the leadership within the structures of the ANC compared to where we are right now. It takes that level of toughness in order for South Africa to pivot from its stagnation that we've seen over the past 10 years and emulate what we've seen in its early decades. And that is how you achieve redress. There's nothing wrong with redressing the past injustices.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine who was very instrumental in how I analyze policy is that you mustn't judge policy for its intention, but you must judge it for its outcomes. The outcomes of expropriation or compensation, as well as that of the current empowerment policies that we're seeing right now, has actually been to the detriment of millions of South Africans, in which we've seen the unemployment number as well. And only a few individuals have actually benefited from those policies. And South Africans know this very well. I also chair the Social Research Foundation. What we've seen is that 70% of registered voters view South Africa's current empowerment policies as only enriching the political elite and not themselves. So the output of that policy, South Africans judge it, is not actually redressing the nation. Instead, it is extracting value away from South Africans towards the ones that are politically connected.
Yeah. No, I like your point when you say that no, we've had times post 1994 where we had better economic growth, with the people's lives being improved, when, at least in your argument, where we had better policies. Because people tend to think that what you and I tend to think the same way. I'm sure people who follow us, they kind of know our commentary. People tend to think that, well, especially our opponents, that we are just speaking something that's never happened in the country, right? Whereas no, we are saying, look, in the first 10, 15 years
Yeah.
of our democracy, we had things were going better in terms of economic, performance. Yeah, it's not like we are saying,
And this is something that's also remarkable that
yeah,
what I would like to also share for people, like watching this and thinking that this is, which is something that I've seen as well. After some of my comments became a little bit more public and more people started reading them, is that
yeah.
you're aligning yourself with white monopoly capitalists. Whereas I'm just quoting what the ANC government achieved. It was quite remarkable, that growth number, not even the Nats achieved that growth number since the 1960s. That even from a fiscal perspective, South Africa managed to achieve a budget surplus never seen before in 100 years. It's not a matter of that this is just white monopoly thinking or black kind of thinking. This is just really sensible policies that will allow the material circumstances of ordinary South Africans. This is who the focus is on ordinary South Africans that just want to educate themselves, that just want to have a job so that they can have an income to sustain themselves as well as that of their families, and also to have savings and assets. These are the people that we are talking about in these conversations. These are not abstract kind of talking points that we're talking about. We're talking about these real people which are voicing out their concerns as well as that of businesses. But those concerns are not being heard from a policy perspective, as well as that from a will to move on firm actions by the ruling government to actually address those needs.
And by the way, in that period, this period you and I are talking about, when you look at GDP per capita, South Africa's GDP per capita, in contrast to the global GDP per capita, there was a very small difference, Bheki, right? And then
Exactly. Exactly.
over the past 15, 16 years, we've seen the gap growing,
Yes. Yes.
you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We were tracking the same GDP per capita. For your listeners, GDP per capita is the size of the South African economy divided by its population. It's a measure to quantify someone's standard of living. So if that trend is going up, it means that your life is generally improving. And for millions of South Africans, that trend was going up, which means their lives were generally improving. Follow that from 2008, you saw a stagnation, which means that it was largely the same to where we currently are in 2024, where that number is even lower than when it was in 2008. What that means is that if you were a South African living in 2008, your quality of life was much better than what it is currently in the country. And that is not, it doesn't need to be the case. Had we maintained those growth levels that we talked about, and
Mm.
up until this point, we would have seen that GDP per capita level be 56,000 greater than what it is currently. That's a difference of millions of households in the country struggling to make ends meet, living paycheck by paycheck,
Yeah.
as well, and of them being in the upper ranks of an emerging middle class economy. That's what we're talking about here, is that there's actually real consequences for the policies that we've seen. Another example of this is what we're seeing now with the management of relations between South Africa and the United States, which have absolutely deteriorated. What we are talking about here, and now they're reporting on this as well, hasn't that been that quite great? Is that the US actually wants to make a deal with South Africa to the scale that would see South Africa's GDP per capita number trickle up than where it is currently, which is that of stagnation and even decline. They want to make table serious deals that would see the growth number reach where it should be, about 4%. However, from a policy perspective, if you look at what happened yesterday, this week with Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, whose visa was rejected, and the non-seriousness from the American side, their perspective towards the government to table the deals necessary at the scale and quantum, that will actually improve the lives of millions of South Africans are actually not being tabled. They're not being serious. The way of thinking is not towards the way that would see the ordinary South Africans' lives generally improve. And this is not from an American perspective. The focus right now is largely due to the tariffs, the 30% tariffs that look to be implemented on the 1st of August. But this is not just America. This is with every other sovereign nation, is that when they look into Pretoria, they're simply frustrated with the ineptitude that they're seeing, as well as not the willingness to actually think of the scale that this country could achieve.
Well, you've gone ahead of me, Peggy, because you've moved to my next segment already. Now, let me to add on that in the form of a question. Uh, can we? I mean, we have a 30% tariff is coming through, from US next month. Do we have time to negotiate a deal between now and the beginning of next month to avoid the 30% tariff? Is it possible at all in your assessment?
My read of this, as you've seen also as of this week, is that no, is that we haven't tabled a perspective, a deal with hard numbers as well as trade details that would see the tariff of 30% being withered away. And that's also the perspective of the American officials that have their eyes on South Africa. Is that the way that they've put it to me is that South Africa's negotiations towards the US have been lethargic. It hasn't been taken seriously enough, and the thinking hasn't been to the scale that would allow the US to actually put in dollar terms the quantum of investment that is needed. The US looks at South Africa and sees enormous amounts of economic potential. It looks at, for example, its adversaries in Africa that have been investing in the billions of dollars towards Africa, and it has largely trailed behind those nations over the past decade and wants to invest. It wants a foothold in South Africa, given that it's the way towards other African countries. And let's put this also into perspective. For the same quality of education and healthcare that I get here in South Africa, I have to pay 7 times higher in the United States. It's much more easier and cheaper for an expat to live in South Africa and to enjoy the same quality of life than they do in the United States. And it's easier here in South Africa, given the moderate way of thinking of South Africans, as well as that of our infrastructure, our great infrastructure as well, and the contribution by the private sector. The infrastructure over the past 10 years has largely stagnated and it's not where it needs to be, but we still, compared to other African nations, which are definitely catching up. And this is something that the South African government should also factor in, is that if it does not table a serious agreement, which I think we won't make by the 1st of August, the United States will simply look at other African countries like Angola, like Namibia, for example, and table agreements with those, which seem to be the case. Is that the US is looking at this and it's simply saying that we are making deals and we're talking with other African officials. However, South Africa continues to disappoint us. It's an enigma compared to other African countries, which seem to have sort of moving towards the way in which to have a favorable trade agreement with the US. It's only us that's seeming not to step in and open that door for trade relations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very important point you are highlighting because I've observed that it seems that to the US we have become an enemy in sub-Saharan Africa in contrast in comparison to other nations. And you say that we should copy India. Tell me about that because
Yes.
you and I we spoke recently even on a call and we spoke a bit about India, right? And
Yes.
you are saying we can copy something there on how to attract investment and how to conduct foreign policy that is in the interest of our nation. Explain the India element to me.
The great example of how to conduct diplomacy is if you look at India, Mr. Modi, for example. If you look at what initially triggered South Africa being an example by Mr. Trump, if you saw those letters that were initially sent about 2 weeks ago, was if you compare Mr. Ramaphosa's statement during the BRICS summit between the 6th and the 7th of July, as well as Mr. Modi of India, you can see two distinct public declarations. Mr. Ramaphosa publicly condemned the United States as well as Israel on its conducting of the 12-day war which was seen in Israel, whereas Mr. Modi was very sensible in his way. If you look at India, India trades with everyone. It trades with Russia, it trades with China, as
Yes,
well
I've
as
seen that. Yeah,
the States.
it's in BRICS as well.
Yes.
You know, which is
The issue is not BRICS.
yeah, the issue.
The
Yeah.
issue that the United States is not that the fact that South Africa is aligned with BRICS. It's the fact that South Africa is choosing to align itself with the country that the United States deems as a national threat to itself as well as its allies. That's the real distinction in which the United States views South Africa as the threat. Compare that to India, which does not have an alliance, a strong alliance with any nation. And the consequence of that is that it allows India to attract about $60 billion of foreign direct investment towards it from the US. That number in dollar terms allows South Africa to plug the short gap of fixed investment number where it is from 15% to where it needs to be about 25%. That is what we're talking about. So when I say copy India, I mean emulate their diplomacy. Don't start doubling down on losing positions. What does South Africa gain with having a strong alliance with Iran? Actually, let's actually look at the trade that South Africa could do with Iran. Compare that to the trade of a country that contributes about 26 to global GDP, as well as contributes that number that I said towards India. South Africa could benefit quite a lot. And those officials are willing to make those agreements towards South Africa. But in fact, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa does not want to deal with those individuals. We see this, for example, with the seriousness that he's taking with his special envoy towards the United States. If you look at the rejection of Mr. Mcebisi Jonas' visa, we also see this with the delays on top of delays with the tabling of those trade negotiations, as well as the tabling of them by the Minister of Trade and Industry. We're not coming towards the table. We're not coming with serious numbers to the scale that the US is looking for.
Mm, mm. And if the 30% rate comes through next month, um, what will be the impact on the economy? I mean, how do you see our economy performing between now and say end of the year, or even beyond the next 18 months
Yeah.
or 12 months or so? I mean, what's going to happen to the economy?
That's a great question. There's been numbers that's been put up, and I'd like to also refer to the numbers that I've seen. South Africa's exports towards the US is about 157 billion rands. If you look at it from 2020, the cumulative 2020 that we've had trade with the US.
Mm,
And we have enjoyed since 2010 a trade surplus with the US, which means that we export more towards the US market than we do import. And that makes
yeah.
sense. The US it has a surplus of consumers that spend quite a lot of money because of that employment number. Many people are employed in that country. Many people have income to spend, so they spend it outside of their borders and they import quite a lot of goods. As a proportion of total trade, South Africa trades about 8.4% of its exports go to the United States. That is a significant number, but it's not a number in that 30% category to jettison South Africa into a category that would be triggering deep recessions, as well as that of South Africa being from a middle class economy to being that of an economy that is below that. So, what my sense is that South Africa continues its trajectory that we've seen over the past decade. We continue to see sub 1% GDP growth, and the 30% tariff, which could be implemented on the 1st of August, just means that it is more so the case that we continue to see what the country has seen over the past decade. Let's also quantify what does this mean for motor vehicle industry, for example. About 30%, oh, sorry, they're about 20% of South Africa's vehicles go to the United States. However, if we lose that trade, it actually would be towards the benefit of poor South Africans that cannot afford to buy a car. We tax a proportion of about 25% on all vehicle imports in the country in order to lift our own domestic production of vehicles, making it very expensive to own cars. And given the infrastructure that the country currently has, where if you look at, for example, townships, they're quite far from the business districts, not necessarily too far, about 40 minutes to about an hour. And I know this because I travel about 40 minutes to an hour coming to work,
Mm,
largely because of the distance. And for millions of those South Africans, they cannot afford to buy a car because of that tariff. Remove that, it becomes cheaper to now import cars. And for example, that of Asian cars as well, coming from China. There as well as we should trade with China as well, making it cheaper for middle class as well as lower middle class individuals to buy cars. So that's what we stand to lose. We stand to lose that 8.4% trade with the United States, which I believe could be taken up by another market. And the overall broader theme of that is that South Africa continues to be that of a low growth environment as well as that of a high unemployment rate.
And that would be bad, man. It would be bad because, well, I feel like all of this, Peggy, is self-inflicted. We could have avoided this, right? All of this could have been avoided with the right
Easily.
policies, the right mindset,
Yeah.
both on domestic and foreign policy. It's um, it's very interesting. I mean, it's been disappointing to see. Now, tell me, when we speak of investment, because I mean, we've been speaking about that. Uh, are we saying both the government and the private sector should invest? Which one is better? Are we saying that maybe we need more private sector investment, or we need it both? Which do we need more when it comes to investment?
Look at those investment numbers, it's just the case that the private sector invests at a quantum compared to that of the government sector.
Mm.
And they are the best to know what happens in their operations. And who are the private sector? It's ordinary South Africans. It's even people that don't own businesses. You are in the private sector. If you're working, you're earning a salary, be it that in the private industry, you're working for a private firm, you are part of the private sector. And what essentially this battle of thinking that we're talking about here is that we are posing the question towards you. Should you be the one to determine how you operate a business, how you should work, the people you should hire, or should it be the government to do that? And the track record given the ANC over the past 17 years is that it hasn't been up to par. So the money that can be best managed is within the private sector. And I think that's where we need to see the investment coming from within the private sector. But however, the commitment, the confidence to get to that level needs to come from policy certainty. We need to remove the nil compensation as well as below market value expropriation clause that we see in the Expropriation by Compensation Act and put back market value in that clause. Other countries do have expropriation clauses. However, they compensate individuals for the property that they have expropriated. South Africa seeks to not do that. Our empowerment policies, which only benefit only the ones that are politically connected, and there's a tax on investment. It's its own tariff. You said this as well. We are simply scoring against our own keeper. That keeper being ordinary South Africans. We are scoring own goals against ourselves. Is that we remove that category and we incentivize businesses that incentivize job creation, people that companies that hire, as well as that it's fine to also have these social programs to uplift the disadvantaged, and we should. It's a good thing to do. However, the way it has been done, a mixture of empowerment policies as well as that of cadre deployment, which is that of the loyalty towards the ANC and not to that of the public, has been to the detriment of the country. If we fix that, but also on energy, which is a point that I'd like to also spend a little bit of time to.
Yeah,
South
yeah,
Africa has
energy, yeah,
enough
briefly, yeah.
coal. Yes. So South Africa has enough coal defunct stations that could be refitted in about 2 to 3 years just on energy policy alone.
Mm,
If we fix that, remove the cap of 1% GDP growth to about 2 to 3% GDP growth. And that will allow an energy surplus that will allow, for example, the manufacturing of steel. The
mm,
structure of the South African economy is that we've moved towards tertiary services. And if you look at our education standards, we have this large surplus of individuals that are less educated and low-skilled individual, which would be better suited for your manufacturing industry. And in order to achieve that, we need firstly the electricity surplus, increase coal burning to see the energy availability factor, which is the proportion of electricity generated by Eskom that is
yeah.
sent out to the South African economy. If that number is below 60%, where it currently is, it means more load shedding. If it is above 60% and is maintained towards 70%, it means less load shedding, as
Mm,
well as the feasibility of steel manufacturing. Never have you seen this in other nations where the quantum of rare earth minerals, as well as that of commodities such as iron ore and magnesium being found in one place And the energy surplus that would allow is that for steel manufacturing to take hold in the country, as well as that of the surplus of the people unemployed to trickle out of the unemployment category into the employment category. Just on that alone, we could see a GDP percent level of about 3%. Remove expropriation or compensation, you see a GDP growth rate of about 4%, largely due to the fact that fixed investment levels in the country would therefore also take upliftment. This is what the country wants achieved. We're not talking about something that's abstract. We did indeed achieve this between 1994 as well as that of 2008. We can once achieve this. This is very much within the table, and I'm actually bullish of the long-term perspective of South Africa. Should we do those very sensible policies that I think we can do?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just one comment in closing, Peggy. Um, the very interesting thing is that if you poll South Africans, they agree with most of what we are saying. They are against, as you said earlier, they're against these empowerment policies.
Yes.
They are against race-based, policies.
Yes.
They are
Yes.
concerned about business. They want jobs. One very interesting statistic. I mentioned it at a conference when I was speaking in Cape Town recently, and this is from the Social Research Foundation. The numbers show at least 80% of South Africans believe that jobs are what is better for our country than social grants.
Yes.
More than
Yes.
80% across all racial groups. It's not a racial thing.
Exactly. The most amazing thing as well is the mindset of South Africans is that they're very moderate in their way of thinking. If you
Mm,
look at last year's election result, we are one of a few emerging markets that when a government which took power from an old administration, moving from a liberation party into that of governance, that we do not transition to see high levels of criminality and lawlessness and violence in the country. Sure, we do have the high murder rate as well as that of high violent protests, but we do not see a trigger across all 9 provinces of a coup d'etat, which was also mentioned yesterday, which was not a coup d'etat. You did not see that in South Africa because of the mindset of South Africans. They're very moderate in the way of thinking. The number one priority is that of jobs. The
yeah.
number one priority is that of merit. You can see that within the Springboks, for example. I watched the fantastic game that happened this past weekend where
Mm,
we beat Italy 45-0.
yeah.
And you can see that for the first time a nation win the Rugby World Cup 4 times. Never
Mm.
seen before.
Never seen before. Yeah, yeah. Peggy, we're out of time. So wonderful to talk to you. Great conversation. Very much educational. It's a country with huge potential. I always say that. We just need to pursue the right policies, both domestic policy as well as foreign policy. So it's great to talk to you, sir, and wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to have the conversation. Hopefully, you have me back on again and I catch you in California whenever you go.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully, we can get some coffee in California next time I'm in the US, which should be sometime in future. It's Phumlani Majosi. This is the Phumlani Majosi Show. Remember to subscribe to this platform. We'll chat soon.